everyone meeting on Malcolm X and the fight today to fight racism. It's so great to see everyone. I'm Layla, I'm a member of the SWP and I'm in South London. It's great to see some other Londoners here and everyone else, of course. So today, obviously, we're going to be talking about Malcolm X. As you just saw, you know, he was and is very relevant in the struggle and in the fight against racism and for liberation of all oppression and exploitation that we see in a capitalist society. And I think this is going to be a really great meeting for anyone who's maybe not familiar with our beliefs and our values as socialists, but also to understand really how Malcolm X is still so relevant today. We've seen the exciting and revolutionary things that have been happening at the moment in response to George Floyd's horrible murder at the hands of the police. We've seen people standing up. We've seen this movement get stronger and get louder. And I think Malcolm X and his values and ideas are going to be really insightful and important for us to keep in mind in our struggle for liberation for everyone. So I'm just going to explain how the meeting is going to go on. So we're going to hear from our two brilliant speakers. We have Antony Hamilton, who is a brilliant author of the book A Rebel's Guide to Malcolm X, and he's joining us from Berlin. And we have Elizabeth Adofo, who is a member of the SWP in South London and an anti-racist activist, also part of Stand Up to Racism. So welcome to our two speakers. We're all so excited to hear from you. After we hear from both speakers, we're going to have a discussion in small rooms. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for about 6 or 7 minutes with a couple of questions that I'll put in the chat and I'll read out to you guys. This is just a great chance for you all to speak to each other, ask each other questions, and just questions to start a discussion, which will be great. And then we'll come back to the group. We'll have a wider discussion where you should raise your virtual hand, ask any questions, any contributions, big or small, any ideas that you've got. It will be really, really great to hear from as many of you as possible. And after we have a discussion, we'll come back to our speakers for a bit for them to sum up, hear what they have to say. And yeah, a couple of announcements and that'll be it. So I'm really, really excited to hear everyone's voices and to talk about this topic. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So we've got Antony Hamilton again, just to reiterate, author of the brilliant book, Rebel's Guide to Malcolm X. Welcome, Antony.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important moment to talk about Malcolm X in this current political climate, because Malcolm's life was one of huge turbulent struggle where he grappled with some of the biggest questions which we're facing right now. Questions of leadership, questions of who can be involved in struggle, and questions of things like where does racism come from? And for Malcolm, none of these answers were obvious in his early life. But towards the end, and right before his assassination, he had radically transformed into a revolutionary figure who argued that international unity was necessary, that capitalism is responsible for racism, and that black and white people must fight together in order to overcome it. But Malcolm wasn't born with any of these ideas in his head. His life was a series of transformations. Malcolm was born with the name Malcolm Little in Nebraska in 1925. And the US back then was divided both geographically and racially. In the South, you had segregation, the KKK, Jim Crow laws, all of these which aimed to keep black people trapped in an intensely exploitative and oppressive relationship to their former slave owners. Whereas in the North, you had the new industrial cities with high job demands, the potential for prosperity for black people. And although segregation wasn't formalized in law, black people were still relegated to certain housing, schools, healthcare. The KKK wasn't organized in the northern cities, but the police stepped into their place, smashing up black businesses and attacking black people and so on. But life in the northern cities did provide an escape from the crushing poverty and the violence of the South. Now for Malcolm, he lived in the North, but he didn't live in one of these cities. He lived in Nebraska, which was quite rural. So there was no formal segregation, but the KKK was a huge organizing force around there that made sure that black families knew that they weren't welcome in white areas. They lynched black people on a regular basis. They firebombed Malcolm's house when he was only 5, and they killed his dad when he was 7. And this is partially because they were a black family living in a white neighborhood. It's also because his parents were members of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvements Association. And this was like a huge organization at its height, hundreds of thousands of members, who built a community around a network of churches, black businesses. They tried to carve out a space for themselves in a racist society with this long-term goal of returning to Africa in order to build this black utopia. And by organizing black people like this, it bolstered this sense of racial pride, that they weren't second-class citizens, that they had something to be proud of and to stand up for. So they challenged racism, but in a very limited way, but were often faced with brutal and fatal attacks. Despite this, despite like the sort of tragedy which Malcolm sort of had as a child, of his house being burnt to the ground by fascists and his father being killed, he was a bright pupil. But he experienced the institutional racism of the educational system when a teacher asked him, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And he said to the teacher he wanted to be a lawyer. He was only like 8 years old at the time when he said this, which is crazy for any 8-year-old to say they want to be a lawyer. But the teacher turned around and said to him, "You had to be realistic about being a nigger and to plan on carpentry instead." And this delivered a huge blow to Malcolm. If anyone's read the autobiography, you see how he begins to notice he's different from the white kids in his class. And then after this, he was moved around various family members and institutions before finally settling with his sister Ella in Boston, in really the heart of the northern city explosions of alternative black culture. Because this was during a time when there was like mass migration of black people from the south to the northern cities. And Malcolm ended up being a part of this culture, swept up into Harlem life. It was people who wore zoot suits, styled their hair in a conch, learned the Lindy Hop, many in a complete rejection of white American society. But he got involved in drugs, gambling, prostitution, really the vices of marginalized black people who were denied any real activity in US society. And he was arrested soon after a series of robberies on white houses with his accomplice, Shorty, and a few white women who were involved in the crimes as well. And it was here that Malcolm experienced the institutional racism of the courtrooms. They were referred to as Schwarz bastards, Schwarz being the German for black. One lawyer called Shorty said to Shorty he had no business associating with white women. And the women were referred to as poor, unfortunate, scared, lost girls. So in 1946, Shorty and Malcolm, who was only 20 at the time, were sentenced to between 8 and 10 years in prison. Now it's in prison where Malcolm begins the next stage of his transformation, the next stage of his life, because it's in prison that he joins the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam have no attachment to mainstream Islam. They believe that white people were the result of a genetic experiment by an evil scientist called Jacob, that they had spread all over the world and would destroy the world and eventually destroy themselves. So while black people waited for this apocalypse of white people, they should organize themselves. So they organized themselves separately. They wanted a segregated society. They wanted separation of black people from whites. And they provided relief and strength to people considered second class, considered criminals, considered villains. They bolstered a sense of racial pride, actually quite similar to Marcus Garvey in building a network of black businesses. They used temples rather than churches, but they organized in similar fashions. But fundamentally, they were an anti-white force, and that challenged white society, and it attracted from that so many disenfranchised black people. Now, after Malcolm joined, he dropped his surname Little and adopted the name X. And he did this because your surname, as a black person in America, your surname was given to your ancestors by their slave owners to essentially label that you were their property. So by dropping that name, it was like a rejection of that. It was like saying, I am my own man, I don't need to be labeled by my slave owner's name. And when Malcolm got out of jail, he rocketed up the ranks of the Nation of Islam. He ended up becoming a national minister, which was a title they entirely created just for him. And you can see where his politics were leading when he says, I charge the white man with being the greatest liar on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest robber on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest deceiver on earth. I charge the white man with being the greatest troublemaker on earth. And at the same time he was saying this, the civil rights movement was also having a meteoric rise of its own. You had Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, the Freedom Riders traveling from the north to the south, Martin Luther King leading the huge peaceful protests. But Malcolm was in opposition to all this because the Nation of Islam preached that integration was the opposite of what black people wanted. They wanted to build their own separate society, and integration was the worst thing for black people. To this, Malcolm said, when someone sticks a knife in my back 9 inches and they pull it out 6 inches, they haven't done me any favor. They should not have stabbed me in the first place. And to the non-violent nature, he said, be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts a hand on you, send him to the cemetery. Now, the problem started arising with the Nation of Islam because they had a reputation of people who talked a lot but never really did much. And so Malcolm started intervening in the protests, started going along to civil rights marches, started trying to preach to the black people who were getting involved in this struggle in the hopes that he could pull them out of it and make them join his organization instead. The problem there, of course, is that Malcolm then became politicized, heavily politicized by these protests, which were calling for justice, calling for demands similar to what we're calling for today. But it all really came to a head because that put a lot of pressure on the Nation of Islam leadership, who didn't want to be involved in politics, didn't want anyone speaking politically for them. And it all came to a head in 1963, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The Nation of Islam told everyone not to say anything about it at all, but Malcolm was questioned in a sermon at Temple Number 7 by a journalist. And he said, "What do you think of the assassination?" Malcolm said, "The chickens had come home to roost, and that being an old farm by myself, chickens coming home never made me sad, they always made me glad," which is a brilliant quote, because really what he's saying there is that all of these horrors which America had exported onto the rest of the world, think of the Vietnam War was around then as well, had finally come back to bite them where it hurts, and he was happy about it. So Malcolm was suspended for the nation after this, and then it was clear he was going to be expelled. But this was sort of like the final stage of Malcolm's development, because he was expelled in March 1964. He was assassinated in February 1965. So you've only got a period there of 11 months where he goes through this massive radical transformation where he rejects segregationism and embraces a much more revolutionary ideology, because he traveled across Africa going on his Hajj, which was his religious pilgrimage to Mecca. But Africa at the time was going through incredibly huge revolutionary anti-colonial movements. And Malcolm was able to meet with people like Nkrumah in Ghana. He met with Nasser in Egypt. He met with revolutionaries in Algeria, took huge influence from the Mau Mau in Kenya. And he prayed alongside white Muslims in Mecca who treated him as a brother. He met light-skinned revolutionaries who challenged his ideas about who can actually fight for a better sort of society. And Malcolm started to see the American race problem in a very different light. Instead of it being a problem instigated by evil whites, he started to see that capitalism was responsible for racism. He said, all the countries that are emerging today from the shackles of colonialism are turning towards socialism. I don't think it's an accident. Most of the countries that were colonial powers were capitalist countries, and the last bulwark of capitalism today is America. Now, after he left Africa, he tried to set up the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which was about creating that international solidarity between what was happening in Africa and what was happening in America, and trying to sort of bring the two together. He was invited to the UK. He spoke in Smethwick, where an area where he visited specifically, invited by the Indian Workers Association, because Asian people were really at the sharpest point of racism at the time. It was right after the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech. It was at a time when fascist mobs would go around and attack Asian people. And it was an incredibly important moment in showing Black and Asian solidarity in action, and saying that we have a commonality in struggle in understanding how we fight back against racism altogether. He also spoke at the Oxford Union. That little section that you saw at the start of the meeting there, that was a part of his speech, which is all full and available online on YouTube. You should definitely all check that out. But that was only a matter of weeks before he was assassinated. So again, that tiny window, really, 11 months, where he goes from preaching that integration is wrong, that the civil rights movement is backwards. He called the March on Washington the farce on Washington, to now saying that actually Black and white people need to fight together, and actually capitalism is the problem. I think it's really important actually to talk about after his assassination, because it's quite easy to get hung up on the specifics about his assassination, on the conspiracies. There's documentaries about it, there's tons of paperwork about it, but I think the more important thing is to look at his legacy. And I know Liz is going to talk about him more, so I'll just sort of mention briefly what his legacy sort of means to socialists. At first, he has his immediate legacy, the legacy of Black Power, which was really taken and embodied by people like Stokely Carmichael, Huey P. Newton, people who set up the Black Panther Party, and the people who really brought about the slogan Black Power, embracing that sense of by any means necessary. He also prophesied the mass riots and uprisings of the late 60s. Only 2 weeks before he was assassinated, He said, I believe there will ultimately be a clash between the oppressed and those that do the oppressing. I believe there'll be a clash for those who want freedom, justice, and equality for everyone, and those who want to continue the systems of exploitation. But his legacy is longer lasting as well. We need to carry on his understanding of capitalism being the problem. And to overthrow racism, we must overthrow capitalism as well. The two are intrinsically linked. And how we organise today to do that matters. Malcolm recognised that race isn't the dividing line in society, and that people from all backgrounds have the potential and the ability to become revolutionaries and transform the conditions around them. And we must take those ideas into the struggle around us. If we're serious about getting rid of racism, then we also have to be serious about building a different world from the one that we have now. And I know that I've rushed through so much information in such a short space of time, so please ask me as many questions as possible in the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Antony. I think you really captured a lot of Malcolm's life, there's a lot to cover. So thank you so much for that. And I think the quotes are really great as well to keep in mind, especially linking racism in this climate to capitalism, which we know as socialists that go hand in hand. And you can't have a capitalist society without a racist one as well. So it's great to hear from you. I'm going to introduce Elizabeth now, who, just to reiterate, is a member of the SWP in South London, also an anti-racist activist for Stand Up to Racism. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you, Anthony, for that brilliant lead off. So yeah, I think it's really important that we understand Malcolm X beyond his death. I think history is a very powerful tool for us to understand oppressions and movements and how we move forward. But we don't just admire people for admiration's sake. I think it's important that we understand the politics behind people. And so about 50 or so years after his death, why is Malcolm X still such an important figure? I mean, still to this day, he's one of the most unapologetically radical thinkers and leaders that the anti-Black movement and the world has ever seen. To quote another memorable group that was inspired by his legacy, the Black Panthers, he brought a sense of power to the people. His words, he spoke of a grand collective power of Black people, and he spoke to the poor and the less educated and the criminals and the masses, and to people who have faced over 400 years of oppression and some of the most brutal violence against them, and telling them that you can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace until he has his freedom. Is just such a truth that I think it resonates so well to people. And he spoke to people with a truth and an honesty that wasn't always palatable. And he made no secrets about the FBI monitoring him and the daily threats to his life and family. And like Anthony said in his lead-off, when talking about JF's death, I mean, a president has been assassinated. America's golden boy, JFK, was saying that the chickens have come to roost is just quite out there. And whether you agree or disagree with his more spicier statements, one thing you can't ignore is his sense of urgency and militancy that he spoke with about the state of racism in America that was really, truly unheard of. And Malcolm was not an armchair revolutionary. His momental courage derived from his knowledge that within the struggles of the masses of Blacks in America rested the solution to racial oppression. And seeing Malcolm fight for Black people in a way that at times was very unpalatable and provided so many people with the confidence to start change within themselves. So many have dedicated their lives to being anti-racist activists from hearing the words of Malcolm. And when someone like this is assassinated, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and it kind of leaves a gaping hole in history, because we know that towards the end of his life, when he was coming away from the ideas of Black separatism, also at a time when he's linking in with Martin Luther King and becoming an internationalist and learning about connecting struggles together, is when his story stops. And it's at this very moment that Malcolm has reached the new heights of revolutionary consciousness that his life and development were ended. And I think that's why he resonates so much with the current Black Lives Matter movement, because I think in times of deep trouble and on brinks of change, people genuinely connect and are drawn to those who offer a real alternative to the system that we face. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm really happy that Black Lives Matter is like top talking point. I'm really happy that it's trending everywhere. But when I envisioned what the revolution would look like, I envisioned it to be something more than just Ben and Jerry's and Yorkshire tea making a few tweets. Because quite frankly, few hashtags or even parliamentary politics to an extent doesn't quite cut it when you are talking about ultimately ending oppression for all people. And many people will collectively agree with that the system isn't working, and that's brilliant, and that's something that we need to be celebrated. And we shouldn't undermine that so many people are on the same page when it comes to racism and are willing to step up and fight the good fight. But if you lean more to the side of a revolutionary and a socialist like myself, and like I believe Malcolm was towards the end of his life, you will argue that the change that we want to see can't be reformed into the system. Malcolm talks about this on his trip, after his trip to Africa, and he says, "It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of black against white, or as purely an American problem. While rather, we are today seeing a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiters." And you see, capitalism and racism are intricately linked. And they're linked because what we've learned from history is that there isn't actually any racist genes. There's not a gene that generally makes you dislike somebody because they are different to you. And for a long part of history, if you study it back, that although there was many other types of forms of oppression, the form of oppression of racism that we're seeing today is actually kind of relatively new. And racism that we see today was born out of the transatlantic slave trade at a time when the world takes a huge step towards industrialization and forms new economic structures, that many of which are still here today. And it is that wealth of black bodies that were hauled across the seas and beaten and abused that propelled the West into its superpower status. Because there's profit in exploiting people. And you can only exploit people for so long if you continue to feed the narrative that they're less than, that they're not of worth. You need to continue to divide and rule, then divide and rule, and then divide and rule again. And I don't think you can get a world without oppression when profit is still on the agenda. And I don't think you can trust that same system to get rid of it, to get rid of the crises that it so naturally causes, and continue to uphold itself. I think those are two contradictory things. And I think the hot bit of this week has been saying that Black Lives Matter is not a moment, it's a movement. But what do we actually mean when we say this? Because saying that is actually a really big responsibility that we have to actually take steps towards making this happen, because the system will do everything in its power to avoid change. And I think it's in these times that we need to follow Malcolm's lead and be bold in our statements and our demands and our actions. And I think that's going to take more than white people checking their privilege or reading why you shouldn't talk about white people, why you shouldn't talk to white people about racism. Fantastic books and all fantastic starts, but we really need to be pushing, because there is an urgency. Black lives are being taken away. Racism in any form, as small as it is in any country, is poisonous and it's dangerous, and ultimately it kills people. And I think that it's also important that we remember that racism shouldn't be a fight that only Black people endure. It is a fight that we must all collectively take, because a world that tears down the rotten system and a world that is anti-racist is a better world for all. And two, because when we come together in solidarity and through organizing, it's when we are strong. And I think if you take anything away from today, is that change can spring from anywhere, and often it's in the most unlikely places at the most unlikely times. How a boy who dropped out of school at the age of 14 from the deep south turned out to be one of the world's greatest revolutionary leaders is quite a mystery. And to be honest, him being killed at the prime of his life is a great injustice. And why 1 out of the thousands deaths in police custody erupted into months of the most mobilized anti-racist movements that many of us are seeing in our lifetime is also unknown. But what is known is that we need lasting change. And it's simply not enough to just accept that things are bad. We must come together and tear down the system by any means necessary. And I think if you're searching for a place to do that, I seriously would urge you, and really, really seriously consider you to join the Socialist Workers' Party, because we are a party that are committed to being anti-racist, committed to being anti-capitalist, committed to bringing power back to the people, to the workers, to the youth, to the oppressed, and to the forgotten. And I look forward in joining you all in the fight. Solidarity.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think you really captured why not only Malcolm's his talkings and his movement is so relevant today, but deeper into why our world, our capitalist world, is a system that's broken, why it's not just about personal privilege, but it's about oppression in all forms, and why, you know, we all need to work together in a louder and in a bigger way, like Malcolm said, to fight it. And I agree with you that, yeah, the best place, I think, to begin is with the SWP, because you are not just part of a fleeting moment of solidarity. You are part of an active party who are constantly taking action, not just talking about things, but actually taking action and fighting all oppression, racism, and exploitation. So thank you very much to both of our brilliant speakers.